erased from the canon, sealed from the congregation, never meant to reach your eyes. Imagine this. A stone chamber beneath Sinai dust, undisturbed, for 3,000 years, and a scroll pressed into the dark by hands that knew what the world was not yet ready to hold. You are not here by accident, traveller. Tonight you will hear what the councils removed, what the translations buried, what the scholars whisper only in locked rooms. A timeline written before Moses descended the mountain. Not by man, by an angel standing at the edge of eternity. What if Genesis was never the beginning, only the door? What if the true record, every covenant, every fallen watcher, every hidden name was sealed inside a book the world forgot on purpose? The air grows heavier now. The silence is watching. Stay with me. There is a room somewhere beneath the weight of centuries where the air does not move. The walls are lined not with shelves, but with silence. The kind of silence that accumulates over millennia, layer upon layer, pressed into the stone the way water presses into limestone until the stone becomes something else entirely. In that room, if you were to light a candle and hold it close to the oldest surface, you would see marks, not decorations, not symbols placed for beauty. Records, carved by someone who understood that what they were writing would one day be forbidden, and wrote it anyway because they also understood that some truths are older than the institutions built to bury them, and older, still, than the fear those institutions depend upon to survive. You have found your way here, traveller, and that is not an accident. The people who arrive in places like this late at night when the world has gone quiet and the ordinary hours have finally released their grip are not the people who stumbled. They are the people who have been in some wordless way called. The Book of Jubilees was called by many names before the council stripped it of them. It was called the Little Genesis. It was called the Heavenly Record. It was called in some Ethiopian manuscript traditions that were themselves very nearly destroyed the Book of the Division of the Days, a title that carries inside it a weight most readers do not immediately feel, because to divide the days is not merely to count them. It is to assert that time itself was structured by an intelligence before human memory began, and that the structure was written down, and that the writing was meant to reach exactly the people it reaches now, in rooms like this, in hours like this one. The scroll that became the Book of Jubilees claims to have originated not from a human author composing in quiet reflection, but from a dictation, an angel specifically identified as the Angel of the Presence, one of the highest order of beings who stand in direct proximity to the source of all creation, descended to Moses on Mount Sinai, not to repeat what had already been given, but to reveal something older, something that preceded even the law. A heavenly record, the text insists, that mapped the entirety of time from its first breath to its last, organized not by accident or improvisation, but by a precise celestial architecture that human civilization was never fully permitted to receive. Moses received the tablets the world remembers. What the Book of Jubilees claims is that he also received the key to reading them, the hidden framework beneath the visible law, and that this second gift was sealed away, passed through careful hands, nearly destroyed more than once, and finally removed from the canon of accepted scripture by councils whose motivations the official record does not fully illuminate. Scholars who have worked in the lower archives of institutions whose names you would recognize, people who have spent years with ink-stained fingers turning pages that crumble at the corner, in rooms of memoirs that smell of old leather and the particular dry cold of preserved things. Those scholars will tell you quietly that the removal of Jubilees from the biblical canon was not a simple theological disagreement. The texts it contained were too precise. The timeline it offered was too structured. It named too many things that powerful interpreters preferred to leave unnamed, and it described the early history of the earth in terms that implicated forces, angels, watchers, hierarchies of spiritual intelligence, whose existence certain later traditions had very carefully transformed into metaphor or into warning or into nothing at all. What had once been described as teachers became through centuries of deliberate reframing demons. What had been called the watchers, beings who descended, who instructed, who interfered, became in the revised tradition simply an allegory for human weakness. The Book of Jubilees refused that revision. It named the watchers. It described their descent. It recorded what they taught and what they corrupted and what was done with their offspring, the giants, the Nephilim, the beings who did not fit into any taxonomy that later civilization wanted to acknowledge. And so the book was set aside. Not destroyed, not entirely, not everywhere, but removed from the rooms where it might have been read by everyone and placed instead in the rooms where only certain people were permitted to enter. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept it. They kept it not as a curiosity, but as canon, as living scripture, as a document whose authority they never surrendered, even when the rest of the world forgot it existed. For over 1,000 years, while the Western traditions were consolidating their approved texts and marginalizing everything that complicated the narrative they had chosen. Monks in highland monasteries were copying the Book of Jubilees by hand, illuminating its margins, singing its passages, treating it as what it claimed to be a revelation given to Moses, that the keepers of that tradition refused to allow to disappear. The dust on those manuscripts is very old. The hands that last copied them are long since returned to earth. But the words remain traveller. The words have always remained. History was rewritten in many places, but it was not erased. Some truths survive only in whispers, and this is one of them, vast, ancient, patient waiting in the silence for the hours when the world grows quiet enough to hear it again. Rest now and listen. The record is about to begin. There is a particular kind of evidence that institutions do not confiscate because they cannot quite bring themselves to acknowledge it exists. It lives in the margins of approved texts, in the footnotes of scholarly works that were themselves never widely circulated, in the careful hesitations of translators who encountered something in an ancient manuscript that did not align with the version their supervisors expected them to produce. The Book of Jubilees is surrounded by this kind of evidence. The evidence of omissions, of deliberate forgetting of a text so precisely inconvenient that the most effective way to neutralize it was not to destroy it, but simply to stop speaking its name in the rooms where decisions about scripture were made. And yet the evidence of its existence, of its antiquity, of its authority in the communities that preserved it, has continued to surface in ways that the official record cannot entirely absorb. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947 in the caves of Qumran by a Bedouin shepherd whose name most people will never learn, contained fragments of the Book of Jubilees in multiple copies, more copies than were found of many texts that the canon had officially endorsed. The community that hid those scrolls in sealed clay jars and pressed them into the darkness of desert caves considered Jubilees essential. They did not preserve it as a historical curiosity. They preserved it as scripture, as living authority, as a document whose contents shaped how they understood time covenant and the structure of the world they inhabited. The scholars who first examined those fragments in the years following the discovery, working in dimly lit rooms in Jerusalem with magnifying glasses and careful brushes in an atmosphere of both excitement and a particular institutional anxiety that was never fully articulated aloud, understood immediately that what they were handling complicated the existing narrative of biblical canon formation in ways that would require years of very careful management. The fragments matched the Ethiopian manuscripts that the Western tradition had been quietly treating as peripheral for centuries. The language matched. The structure matched. The theology matched. What this meant in terms that the official story of Scripture preferred not to confront directly was that the removal of Jubilees from the accepted canon was not a recognition of its late composition or its marginal status. It was a choice. A deliberate editorial decision made by people with the institutional power to determine what future generations would be permitted to call the Word of God and what they would be encouraged to treat as something lesser, something apocryphal, something that well-meaning but misguided ancient communities had mistakenly elevated beyond its proper station. The evidence does not support that characterization. The evidence, when examined without the pressure of institutional expectation, tells a different story entirely. What the Book of Jubilees preserves is a cosmological framework of extraordinary precision. The text does not merely retell the stories of Genesis, it explains the architecture beneath them. It provides dates, specific enumerated dates organized according to a calendar of 364 days divided into 4 seasons of 13 weeks each, a solar calendar of such mathematical elegance that astronomers and historians of ancient science have spent considerable effort trying to determine how a people without modern instruments could have arrived at its structure with such confidence. The calendar of Jubilees is not approximate. It is deliberate. It implies knowledge of celestial mechanics that the official timeline of human intellectual development does not comfortably accommodate, and the text presents this knowledge not as human discovery, but as revelation, as something transmitted from a level of intelligence that existed before human civilization began counting its own years. The keepers of the approved narrative have for the most part treated this as mythology, but the mathematics do not behave like mythology. The mathematics behave like a record, and records imply a recorder, and the identity of that recorder is precisely the question that the Book of Jubilees forces into the open in ways that make certain scholars very uncomfortable in their quietly carpeted institutional offices. There are researchers, not fringe writers, not amateur enthusiasts, but credentialed academics working within the structures of universities and theological institutions who have noted and published papers in language measured enough to pass through the filters of peer review that the Book of Jubilees displays a coherence of internal chronology that is by any reasonable assessment remarkable. Every event it describes is anchored to a specific week of a specific year, of a specific Jubilee cycle. The patriarchs are born on recorded days, they marry on recorded days, they die on recorded days. The covenants are made at precise moments within a structure of time so carefully mapped that deviations from it are themselves theologically significant. The text treats disorder in the calendar as a form of spiritual catastrophe, as evidence that something has gone wrong in the relationship between heaven and earth. This is not the thinking of a forger. This is not the casual composition of someone filling in narrative gaps for the entertainment of their community. This is the thinking of someone who understood that time itself was a covenant, that the structure of the year was a form of communication between the creator and the created, and that losing track of that structure was a kind of forgetting so profound it amounted to a severing of the relationship that held everything together. The evidence for this understanding is present on every page, and the evidence that this understanding was considered dangerous enough to suppress is present in every library where the Book of Jubilees is not shelved among the texts that shape the faith of billions. Somewhere beneath the weight of that suppression, the original record still waits, patient as stone, old as the first day. Rest now, traveller, and let the evidence speak in its own time. There is a moment in the work of every serious researcher when the evidence stops behaving the way the accepted framework predicts it should. It happens quietly, usually late in the evening, when the building has emptied, and the only sound is the particular hum of old fluorescent lighting above a table covered in photocopied manuscripts. A detail surfaces that does not fit, a date that cannot be reconciled with the approved chronology, a name that appears in two separate traditions that were supposedly entirely isolated from one another, a structural parallel so precise that coincidence becomes by any honest calculation an insufficient explanation. The researcher sits with this moment, and in that sitting there is a choice, the choice to note the anomaly and set it aside, to file it in the mental category of things that will require further examination at some unspecified future time, or to follow it carefully into the territory where the approved maps stop being reliable, and the only tools available are patience, rigour, and the willingness to arrive at conclusions that the institution funding the research may not welcome. The Book of Jubilees is in its entirety an anomaly of exactly this kind. It is not anomalous because it is strange. It is anomalous because it is too coherent, too precise, too internally consistent for the explanations that have been offered, for it to fully account for what it actually contains. Consider the matter of the Watchers. In the brief account preserved in Genesis, the sons of God saw the daughters of men, and took wives from among them, and their offspring were the Nephilim, the giants, the mighty ones of old. The account is 4 verses long. It raises more questions than it answers. And the tradition that inherited Genesis has spent centuries managing those questions by minimizing them, by treating the passage as allegory, by insisting that the sons of God were simply the descendants of Seth, and the daughters of men were simply the descendants of Cain, a reading so transparently insufficient that it required generations of institutional authority to make it stick. The Book of Jubilees does not minimize the Watchers. It names them as angels, beings of a specific order assigned to a specific function, who descended to earth in the days of Jared with a purpose that was initially instructional and became something far more complicated. They were sent to teach. That is the detail the approved tradition has worked hardest to erase, because a being sent to teach is a being with a mission, and a mission implies a sender, and ascender implies a structure of intelligence operating above the level of human civilization in ways that the institutions built upon the idea of a single, singular, unmediated revelation find extraordinarily difficult to incorporate into their frameworks without those frameworks requiring fundamental reconstruction. What the Watchers taught, according to the record that Jubilees preserves, was knowledge. Practical, applied, specific knowledge, the kind of knowledge that accelerates the development of a civilization in ways that the purely gradual model of human intellectual progress does not easily explain. They taught the reading of celestial signs. They taught the interpretation of patterns in the sky that corresponded to patterns on the earth. They taught, in other words, a form of understanding that required the observer to perceive the relationship between heaven and earth as a structured system of communication rather than as a backdrop against which human history accidentally unfolded. And then the record tells us something went wrong. The Watchers who had been sent to instruct allowed the boundary between instruction and interference to dissolve, and what followed was a contamination so profound that the text describes it as the primary cause of the flood. Not human wickedness in the general sense, but a specific corruption of the boundary between kinds of beings, a violation of the categories that the Creator had established at the beginning of time when everything was set in order and appointed its proper place and function. The giants born of that union were not merely large. They were wrong in a categorical sense. Beings whose existence represented a disruption of the structure that held the world together, the world responded to that disruption in the way that systems respond to fundamental violations of their organizing principles. The anomaly deepens when you examine what the tradition chose to do with this information. The beings described in Jubilees as teachers who transgressed their mandate were systematically recast across centuries of theological development as demons, as beings whose defining characteristic was elos, rather than overreach, whose origin was rebellion, rather than assignment, whose relationship to humanity was adversarial, rather than corrupted instructional. This recasting was not accidental. It served a very specific institutional function, which was to eliminate from the cosmological record any suggestion that the development of human civilization had involved assistance from intelligences that operated outside the structure of the single approved revelation. If the Watchers were simply demons, their teachings were simply temptation, and the knowledge they transmitted was simply corruption, and the entire question of where certain forms of ancient understanding came from could be closed without further examination. The Book of Jubilees refuses that closure. It holds the record open. It preserves the anomaly in all its inconvenient precision, carved into the structure of a text that survived desert caves and highland monasteries and centuries of institutional indifference, precisely because the truth it contained was too specific to be entirely forgotten. Somewhere in the silence between what the official story says and what the record actually shows, something ancient still waits to be properly understood. Rest now, traveller. The anomaly has only just begun to reveal its shape. There is a specific quality to the silence that surrounds a suppressed text. It is not the silence of something that was never said. It is the silence of something that was said very clearly in very precise language by people who understood exactly what they were recording and why it mattered, and was then surrounded by a carefully constructed absence, an institutional quiet that is to anyone who has learned to read it louder than any prohibition could ever be. Libraries communicate through their omissions as much as through their collections. The shelves that are empty, the catalogue entries that lead nowhere. The footnotes in approved texts that refer to sources and then decline to quote them. These are the architecture of a managed silence, and the Book of Jubilees has been living inside that architecture for nearly 2,000 years, present enough that scholars could not pretend it did not exist, absent enough that the general reader would never think to ask about it. The science around Jubilees is one of the most precisely shaped sciences in the history of religious literature, and the shape of it tells you almost as much as the text itself. Consider what happened in the centuries following the consolidation of the biblical canon. The councils that made the decisions about which texts would be included and which would be designated as outside the boundary of approved scripture did not for the most part explain their reasoning in terms that have survived intact. What survives are the decisions themselves, and the decisions regarding Jubilees are in historical context remarkable for what they do not say. The text is not declared heretical in any formal sense. It is not condemned with the sustained institutional energy that was directed at other texts deemed genuinely dangerous to the established order. It is simply not included. and the silence that surrounds that exclusion has the particular quality of a decision made in a room from which all the documentation has been carefully removed. Scholars who have examined the patristic literature, the writings of the early church fathers who were present in and around the period of canon formation, find occasional references to Jubilee's brief acknowledgements of its existence, and then a closing of the subject that has the quality of a door being shut with deliberate gentleness, rather than slammed in anger. The gentleness is itself informative. Texts that are simply wrong are argued against. Texts that are inconvenient are quietly set aside. The Ethiopian tradition preserved what the Western consolidation set aside, and the nature of that preservation illuminates the nature of the silence from a different angle. In the highland monasteries where Jubilees was copied and kept and read as living scripture, there was no sense that the text was dangerous or marginal or in need of careful management. It was simply true. It was simply part of the record. The monks who spent their lives in those communities rising before dawn to pray in stone churches whose walls were covered in painted figures of angels and patriarchs, and the great events of sacred history treated the Book of Jubilees the way the Western tradition treated the approved Gospels, which is to say they treated it as a window, rather than a wall, as a means of seeing more clearly, rather than a boundary marking the edge of permitted vision. The contrast between this living relationship with the text and the managed silence of the Western institutional tradition is not a minor theological disagreement. It is a record of two entirely different decisions about what human beings are permitted to know about the structure of the world they inhabit and the forces that shaped it before their memory began. The silence extends in particularly interesting ways into the academic literature of the modern period. There are university courses on the Hebrew Bible in institutions whose endowments were built by people who considered themselves guardians of the tradition, and those courses do not include the Book of Jubilees in their required reading. There are seminaries where students spend years preparing to interpret sacred texts for the communities they will serve, and graduate without having read a document that the community at Qumran considered essential enough to preserve in multiple copies beneath the desert floor. There are theologians who have published extensive works on the development of Jewish and Christian thought in the Second Temple period, precisely the period in which Jubilees was most actively circulated and most deeply influential, and managed to construct their arguments around the text, rather than through it referring to it in subordinate clauses and footnotes while reserving their central analysis for the texts that the institutional tradition has decided to treat as primary. This is not ignorance. These are educated people working in well-resourced institutions with access to the scholarship. This is the continuation of the silence by other means, the academic reproduction of a decision made in rooms 2,000 years ago by people whose names we mostly do not know, whose reasoning we cannot fully reconstruct, and whose legacy is an absence shaped so precisely that it has become to those who have learned to look for it one of the most significant presences in the entire history of how human civilization has chosen to remember and forget the oldest things it was ever told. Somewhere in the weight of that absence, the text itself continues to breathe, patient as the dark between stars, old as the first silence before the first word was spoken. Rest now, traveller. The quiet here is not emptiness. It is everything that was decided you should not hear. There are epochs that the official record of human civilization has decided not to remember, not because nothing happened in them, but because what happened in them does not fit the narrative that the institutions built upon a particular version of human origins need to be true in order to maintain the coherence of everything they have constructed on top of that version. The standard account of human development moves in a single direction, from simple to complex, from primitive to sophisticated, from ignorance to knowledge, in a slow and largely uninterrupted progression that positions the present moment as the most advanced point in the story, and everything before it as a series of increasingly rudimentary approximations of where we have now arrived. The Book of Jubilees does not tell that story. The Book of Jubilees tells a story in which the earliest epochs of human existence were characterized not by ignorance but by a proximity to knowledge, so complete that everything which came after represents not progress, but a long and painful recession from an original clarity that was lost, corrupted, buried, and only partially recovered across the thousands of years that followed its disappearance. That is not a story that the progressive model of human development can absorb without fundamental revision. And fundamental revision is not something that institutions invest in willingly. The forgotten epoch that Jubilees describes begins before the flood and ends with it. It is the period in which the Watchers were present on earth, in which the boundary between the celestial and the terrestrial was permeable in ways it has not been since in which human beings had direct access to forms of understanding that the text presents as having been transmitted from the highest levels of the created order. Enoch is the central figure of this epoch, and the treatment of Enoch in the Book of Jubilees is one of the most striking examples of the gap between what the preserved record actually says and what the managed tradition has allowed people to know about it. In the approved canon, Enoch appears in a genealogical list in Genesis, and is given 2 remarkable details: he walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. 7 verses. A figure of extraordinary significance reduced to the briefest possible acknowledgement, surrounded by the births and deaths of patriarchs whose lifespans are given in precise numbers, but whose inner lives are almost entirely absent from the record. The Book of Jubilees gives Enoch back his depth. It describes him as the first human being to learn writing, the first to record the movements of celestial bodies, the first to understand the relationship between the patterns of the sky and the structure of time on earth, and the recipient of a vision so comprehensive that it encompassed the entirety of human history from its beginning to its end. What Enoch was shown, according to the record that Jubilees preserves, was not simply a prophetic glimpse of future events. It was the architecture of time itself, the Jubilee cycles, the weeks of years, the precise structure of a calendar that mapped the relationship between heaven and earth in mathematical terms, whose elegance implies a designer rather than an accident. He was taken into the presence of beings who showed him everything that was on earth and in the heavens, and he wrote it all down, and he placed that testimony on earth for all the children of men and for their generations. The text is precise about this. Enoch did not merely receive a vision. He produced a written record, a testimony intended to survive beyond his own disappearance, intended to reach the generations who had come after the flood had erased the civilization that had accumulated the knowledge he was encoding. The fact that this record, the books of Enoch, which survive in various forms in the Ethiopian canon and in fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls, was also excluded from the approved Western tradition, is not a coincidence that the silence around these texts invites you to overlook. It is a pattern, and patterns in the management of ancient knowledge deserve the same careful attention that patterns in the ancient knowledge itself have always received from the people willing to look at them honestly. The forgotten epoch is forgotten in the deepest sense because it represents a model of the relationship between humanity and the wider cosmos that the institutional tradition built upon a single bounded, mediated revelation cannot incorporate without surrendering the claim to exclusivity that is the foundation of its authority. If human beings in the period before the flood had direct access to celestial teachers, if the knowledge of time and covenant and the structure of creation was transmitted not through a single nation, at a single mountain, at a single moment in history, but through a sustained engagement between earthly and heavenly intelligence that predated all of recorded civilization, then the architecture of religious authority built upon the uniqueness of that single transmission becomes something considerably more complicated than its builders intended. The Book of Jubilees does not make this argument explicitly. It simply records what it records in the calm and precise voice of a document that has always known it contained more than the institutions surrounding it were prepared to acknowledge. The forgotten epoch waits in that record like a room that has been sealed for a very long time, in which everything is exactly as it was left and in which the dust on the surfaces is the only evidence of how much time has passed since anyone was last permitted to enter. Somewhere in the layers of what was intentionally forgotten, the original clarity still holds its shape. Rest now, traveller. The oldest epochs do not disappear. They simply wait beneath the weight of everything built on top of them, patient as bedrock, ancient as the first morning. There are moments in the history of the world when the accumulated weight of what has gone wrong becomes so complete, so total, so embedded in every layer of existence, from the behaviour of individual human beings to the structure of the civilizations they have built, that the only available response is erasure. Not correction, not reform, not the careful dismantling and rebuilding that a more measured intervention might allow. Erasure. The removal of everything that has been corrupted down to the level at which corruption first took hold, followed by the slow and deliberate reconstruction of a world that has been returned through catastrophe to something closer to its original condition. The flood described in the Book of Jubilees is not a natural disaster, in the sense that the modern reader trained to think of ancient catastrophe narratives as primitive explanations for geological events is accustomed to understanding natural disaster. It is a reset, a precise, intentional, cosmologically structured intervention in the course of a history that had deviated so far from its intended architecture that continuation had become, from the perspective of the intelligence that designed the architecture, less viable than beginning again. The Book of Jubilees is specific about what made the reset necessary, and the specificity is itself one of the most striking features of a text that is consistently more precise than the approved tradition has wanted people to know. The corruption that preceded the flood was not primarily moral in the sense of individual human beings making bad choices within a functioning social order. It was ontological, a corruption of the categories of being themselves, a violation of the boundaries that separated kinds of creatures from one another, a dissolution of the distinctions that the Creator had established at the moment of creation, when everything was set in its proper order and appointed its proper function. The Watchers had crossed the boundary between the celestial and the terrestrial. Their offspring had crossed the boundary between the human and the inhuman. The knowledge they had transmitted had been turned toward purposes that the original transmission never intended, and the civilization that had grown up in the shadow of that misuse was not merely wicked in the ordinary sense, but structurally wrong, built upon a foundation of categorical violation that could not be reformed from within because the violation had become the foundation. You cannot repair a building by adjusting the windows when the ground beneath it has shifted. You clear the site and you begin again. Noah is the figure around whom the reset organizes itself, and this treatment of Noah in Jubilees is considerably more detailed and structurally significant than the version preserved in the approved canon. He is not simply a righteous man who builds a boat and survives a flood. He is a man whose righteousness is described in terms of categorical precision. He had not departed from aught that was ordained for him. The text says in language that positions his virtue not as emotional fidelity or spiritual feeling, but as structural alignment with the architecture of creation. He was right in the way that a measurement is right in the way that a calculation that has been checked against every available verification comes back consistent each time. His survival was not sentiment. It was the preservation of the one remaining point of authentic alignment in a world that had become entirely misaligned, the single thread of the original design that the reset could use as its starting point for the reconstruction that would follow. The Ark is, in this reading, not primarily a boat. It is a vessel for carrying the uncorrupted blueprint of the world across the gap between the civilization that had to be ended and the civilization that was going to have to be built in its place. What the reset preserved, according to the record that Jubilees maintains with its characteristic precision, was not merely human life, but knowledge, specifically the knowledge that Noah received from the beings who had regained their proper orientation through the period of corruption, the medicinal and cosmological understanding that was encoded in the books he received and passed to Shem, his eldest son, because he loved him exceedingly above all his sons. The transmission of those books is one of the details that the approved tradition has most consistently failed to examine with the attention it deserves, because what it implies is a continuity of recorded knowledge across the catastrophic boundary of the flood. An unbroken thread of understanding, connecting the antediluvian world to the post-diluvian one, carried not in the memory of survivors, but in written documents whose contents were specific enough to require preservation in physical form. The institutions that have built their authority upon the idea of a single originating revelation at a single moment in history have a considerable investment in the discontinuity of the flood narrative, in the idea that everything before the flood was irretrievably lost, and everything after it began fresh unencumbered by whatever had accumulated in the corrupted civilization that the waters erased. The Book of Jubilees insists otherwise. It insists on the continuity. It insists on the books. It insists that the reset was not a destruction of knowledge, but a preservation of it carried across the boundary of catastrophe by people who understood that what they were carrying was more important than anything else that might survive. Somewhere in the memory of what was preserved across that boundary, the original architecture of the world before the corruption still exists in fragmentary form encoded in texts that the institutional tradition has spent centuries treating as peripheral, precisely because their contents are so foundational. Rest now, traveller. The reset was never the end. It was always from the very beginning a continuation by other means. There is a phenomenon that historians of ancient cultures encounter with a frequency that the standard model of independent civilizational development cannot comfortably explain, in which the same structures of understanding, the same cosmological frameworks, the same calendar systems, the same hierarchies of celestial beings, the same narratives of a primordial catastrophe followed by a divinely supervised reconstruction, appear in cultures separated by thousands of miles of ocean and mountain range in periods when the approved account of human prehistory insists that no meaningful contact between those cultures could have occurred. The standard response to this phenomenon, within the institutions that have the most invested in the independence model, is to invoke parallel development, the idea that human minds confronted with the same natural environment and the same existential questions will independently arrive at similar answers. It is a reasonable hypothesis in cases where the similarities are general and the parallels are approximate. It becomes considerably less reasonable when the similarities are specific, when the parallels are precise, when the same numbers appear in the same relationships to the same celestial events in traditions whose supposed independence from one another is the cornerstone of an entire disciplinary framework. The Book of Jubilees echoes through the ancient world in exactly this way, precisely structurally, in the manner of a signal rather than a coincidence. The Jubilee system itself, the organization of time into units of 7 years, 7 weeks of years, 7 Jubilees, appears in recognizable form in traditions far removed from the Semitic world in which the text was composed and preserved, the sacred significance of the number 7, its relationship to cycles of completion and renewal, its embedding in both celestial mechanics and social organization surfaces in Mesopotamian astronomical records, in Egyptian ritual calendars, in the mathematical structures underlying the construction of monuments whose builders the official timeline of human intellectual development places well below the level of sophistication required to have arrived at those structures through independent calculation. The echo is not faint. It's clear enough that scholars who have examined these parallels without the institutional pressure to explain them away, have published careful measured arguments suggesting that what we are looking at is not parallel development but transmission, the movement of a body of knowledge from a common source through channels that the approved prehistory of human civilization has not yet adequately mapped and in some cases has actively resisted mapping, because the implications of the map would require the revision of frameworks too large and too deeply embedded to revise without considerable institutional disruption. The echo of the Watchers is perhaps the most pervasive of all, the figures of the celestial teacher. The being from a higher order of existence who descends to Earth, transmits knowledge to human civilization and then departs, or is removed under circumstances that the tradition preserving the account treats as catastrophic, appears with remarkable consistency across the ancient world. In Mesopotamia they are the Apkallu, the 7 sages who came from the ocean before the flood and taught humanity the arts of civilization. In the Vedic tradition, they are the rishis, the seers who received knowledge from a cosmic source and transmitted it in the form of hymns, whose mathematical structure encodes information about the relationship between sound and the architecture of the universe. In the traditions of Mesoamerica, they are the feathered serpents, the culture bearers who arrived from elsewhere, taught and left behind the calendar systems and astronomical alignments that the civilizations they visited maintained with a precision that astonished the Europeans who encountered them, and immediately set about destroying them. The Book of Jubilees does not reference these parallel traditions. It does not need to. It simply records the original signal with the fidelity of a document that understood it was preserving something that would need to be heard again, long after the civilization in which it was first transmitted had been reset, scattered, and partially forgotten. What the echo tells us, if we are willing to listen to it without the interference of the frameworks built to prevent us from hearing it clearly, is that the Book of Jubilees is not an isolated text produced by a particular religious community for its own internal purposes and then accidentally preserved while more important documents were lost. It is one of the clearest surviving transmissions of a body of knowledge whose original form predates all the traditions that contain its fragments, a signal sent across the enormous distances of time and geography, in the hope that enough of it would arrive intact for the pattern to be reconstructible from what survived. The fragments that survive in Jubilees are more complete than most. The precision of the calendar, the specificity of the Jubilee cycles, the detailed account of what was taught and by whom and with what consequences, all of this represents a fidelity of transmission that the managing institutions have spent considerable energy characterizing as the obsessive theological systematizing of a Second Temple Jewish community, because systematizing is a motive that can be contained within the approved narrative, whereas faithful transmission of pre-flood cosmological knowledge is a motive that cannot. Somewhere in the distance between those two characterizations, the echo continues to move through time, arriving in each new generation with the same information. It has always carried patient as sound travelling through a medium too dense for most ears to register until the conditions are exactly right. Rest now, traveller. The echo does not diminish with distance. It waits for the silence deep enough to hear it in. There is a difference between a coincidence and a pattern, and the difference is not merely quantitative, not simply a matter of how many times the same thing appears before the skeptical mind is obligated to take it seriously. The difference is structural. A coincidence is an event without a generator. A pattern is evidence of a generator of something underlying the surface of observable phenomena that is producing the regularity you are seeing, whether or not you can yet identify what that something is, or explain the mechanism by which it operates. The Book of Jubilees is at its deepest level an argument about pattern, an insistence that what appears to the casual observer as the random accumulation of human history is in fact the surface expression of a structure so precise, so mathematically elegant, so consistent across the entirety of time from the first day of creation to the moment of ultimate restoration, that the only adequate description of it is intentional. The God of Jubilees is not the God of improvisation. He is the God of the pattern, the architect of a timeline so carefully designed that every covenant, every generation, every catastrophe and renewal fits within it. The way a precisely cut stone fits within a wall, not approximately, not roughly, but exactly in a relationship of mutual support that reveals the intelligence of the builder and the perfection of the fit. The Jubilee cycle is the fundamental unit of the pattern. 49 years, 7 weeks of 7 years constitute a single Jubilee, and the entirety of sacred history from the creation of Adam to the giving of the law on Mount Sinai is organized by the text into a sequence of Jubilees whose internal structure is as consistent as the structure of a crystal, repeating the same relationships at every scale, from the individual life of a patriarch to the arc of civilizational catastrophe and renewal. This is not how human beings naturally organize historical narrative. Human beings organize historical narrative around the memorable, the dramatic, the personally significant, around the events that felt important to the people who experienced them, with a connective tissue of ordinary time compressed or discarded. The Jubilee structure of Jubilees does the opposite. It insists on the connective tissue. It insists that the ordinary time between the dramatic events is as structurally significant as the events themselves, that the pattern requires every element to be in its proper position in order to be legible, and that the legibility of the pattern is itself a form of revelation, a demonstration available to anyone who examines the timeline with sufficient care. That what looks like history is actually something more like a score, a written-out version of a composition whose beauty is only fully perceptible to someone who can see it. Enough of it at once to recognize the theme. The patriarchal genealogies, which the reader of Genesis encounters as a sequence of names and ages that seem to serve primarily as chronological scaffolding for the more dramatic narratives, become in the structure of Jubilees something considerably more significant. The text records not merely how old each patriarch was when he fathered his notable son, but the specific week of the specific Jubilee in which each marriage occurred, each child was born, each death took place. When you lay this information out in sequence and examine it for internal relationships, what emerges is not a random distribution of dates, but a set of recurring intervals and correspondences that suggests the dates were recorded because they were meaningful, because their position within the Jubilee structure communicated something about the spiritual significance of the event they marked, about the relationship between that event and the series' larger pattern of which it was a part. The birth of Noah in the 15th Jubilee, the flood in the 27th, the covenant with Abraham in the 41st, these are not the dates a forger would choose, because a forger working to create the impression of historical authenticity would distribute events to avoid the appearance of suspicious regularity. These are the dates a recorder would preserve because the recorder understood that the regularity was the point. The pattern extends in ways that the text treats as both cosmological fact and theological argument beyond the purely human record into the structure of creation itself. The 22 kinds of work completed in the 6 days of creation correspond. The text insists to the 22 heads of mankind from Adam to Jacob in a parallel that positions the history of the patriarchal line as a recapitulation of the creation week. at the scale of human time a micro-pattern nested within the macro-pattern of the original making, suggesting that the same intelligence that organized the first 6 days organized the first 22 generations, and that the relationship between those two structures is not metaphorical but mathematical, not poetic, but architectural. This is the thinking of someone who had access to the blueprint, not someone who had heard descriptions of the blueprint and was doing their best to reconstruct it from memory. Someone who had seen the original document and understood that their task was faithful transmission rather than creative interpretation, preservation rather than elaboration, fidelity to a structure too important to risk distorting with the ordinary human impulse toward narrative improvement. Somewhere in the precision of that transmitted pattern, the intelligence that originally designed it remains legible, not as a theological abstraction, but as a mathematical presence embedded in the relationships between numbers and dates and generations in a text that the institutional tradition has spent 2,000 years treating as peripheral precisely because its contents are so central. Rest now, traveller. The pattern does not require your attention to continue operating. It has been running since before the first human mind was capable of perceiving it, and it will continue long after the last institution built to manage its implications has returned to dust. There is a particular kind of warning that does not arrive in the form of alarm. It does not raise its voice. It does not demand immediate action or attempt to provoke the adrenaline response that the human nervous system reserves for threats that are immediate, physical, and close. It arrives instead in the form of a record, a careful, precise, unflinching account of what happened the last time the warning was not heeded, presented without editorial embellishment and without the emotional manipulation of a narrator who wants to frighten rather than inform in the calm voice of someone who has examined the evidence thoroughly and arrived at conclusions whose gravity does not require dramatization, because the facts themselves, stated plainly, are more serious than any dramatization could make them. The Book of Jubilees issues this kind of warning across the entirety of its 50 chapters, woven into the structure of its historical narrative so completely that it is impossible to read the text with genuine attention and miss it. And yet the institutions that have managed access to the text have succeeded with remarkable effectiveness in ensuring that most of the people who might have needed to hear the warning never encountered the document in which it was recorded. The warning concerns time. Specifically, it concerns the corruption of time, the gradual incremental institutionally managed process by which the precise solar calendar that the text presents as the authentic structure of the created year has been replaced in the traditions that inherited the responsibility for maintaining it with a lunar calendar that the text explicitly identifies as a deviation from the original design. This may seem to the contemporary reader accustomed to treating calendrical disputes as matters of purely technical or sectarian interest, like a warning of limited scope, a concern for specialists in ancient astronomical systems, rather than a matter of the kind of civilizational significance that would justify the gravity with which Jubilees presents it. But the text is not issuing a technical complaint about computational methods. It is issuing a structural warning about the consequences of losing track of the architecture of time, because in the cosmological framework that Jubilees preserves, the calendar is not a human convenience for organizing social life. It is the mechanism by which the created order communicates with itself, the structure through which the relationship between heaven and earth is maintained, and the corruption of the calendar is therefore not a minor administrative error, but a severing of the thread that connects human existence to the pattern that gives it meaning. The text is precise about the mechanism of this severing in ways that suggest direct knowledge of how the corruption would unfold, rather than prophetic speculation about hypothetical future events. Those who observe the moon, the warning states, will find that it disturbs the seasons and arrives 10 days too soon each year, and this accumulating displacement will cause the festivals of the covenant to fall on the wrong days, and the wrong days observed as holy days will produce a progressive misalignment between the human community and the structure of creation. It was designed to be in relationship with, and the misalignment will deepen with each generation that inherits it, without recognizing it as inherited error rather than original design. The people living inside the corrupted system will not experience it as corruption. They will experience it as tradition, as the way things have always been done, as the received practice of their community, whose authority rests precisely on its antiquity and continuity. They will not know that the antiquity that they are venerating is the antiquity of a mistake, because the record that would allow them to recognize the mistake as a mistake has been removed from the canon that their tradition treats as authoritative. The warning was written into the text that was then excluded from the tradition it was warning. The precision of that irony is either accidental, or it is itself a kind of evidence about the nature of the forces that manage the exclusion. The warning about time is embedded within a larger warning about forgetting about the systematic loss of the specific, precise, structurally significant knowledge that the earliest keepers of the record understood to be the foundation of everything that mattered about human existence in relation to the created order. The text describes in language whose calm is more unsettling than any apocalyptic rhetoric could be a generation in which the sons convict their fathers of sin and unrighteousness, in which every mouth speaks iniquity, in which the covenant and the commandments and the feasts and the jubilees are all forgotten together, not through active rejection but through the gradual attrition of a tradition that stopped transmitting its most essential contents and preserved only the outer forms from which the inner substance had quietly drained away over centuries of managed diminishment. This is not a description of a civilization that has dramatically collapsed. It is a description of a civilization that has slowly forgotten what it was supposed to be, and continued to function on the momentum of inherited structures long after the understanding that gave those structures their meaning had been lost. The warning was recorded because the recorder understood that this kind of forgetting was the most dangerous kind, not the forgetting that announces itself as loss, but the forgetting that presents itself as continuity that wears the face of tradition while carrying none of its original substance. Somewhere in the distance between what the tradition once knew and what it has preserved, the warning continues to stand in the recorder patient and precise, waiting for the generation willing to read it, without the filters that the managing institutions have spent centuries installing between the text and the reader. Rest now. No, traveller, the warning does not expire. It was written for exactly this hour, in exactly this silence, for exactly the mind that has followed the record this far, and is only now beginning to understand what it has actually been reading. There is a reason that every ancient civilization of consequence oriented its most important structures toward the sky, not towards the horizon, not toward the nearest source of water, not toward the most defensible geographical position toward the sky with a precision that required generations of sustained observation, mathematical sophistication and institutional commitment to the kind of long-term record-keeping that only a civilization with a very specific reason to track celestial movements would maintain across the centuries required to produce the alignments that archaeologists continue to discover and continue to struggle to explain within the framework of a prehistoric humanity that was, according to the approved developmental timeline, not yet supposed to be capable of the calculations those alignments represent. The Book of Jubilees does not treat the sky as a backdrop. It treats the sky as a document, a written record of the structure of time encoded in the movements of the sun and moon and stars by the same intelligence that organized the Jubilee cycles and the patriarchal genealogies and the precise sequence of covenants, and readable by anyone who had been taught the language in which it was written, which is to say readable by the Watchers, by Enoch, by Noah and by Abraham, and increasingly unreadable by every generation that came after them, as the knowledge of that language was progressively managed out of the tradition that was supposed to preserve it. The solar calendar of Jubilee's 364 days, divided into 4 seasons of 13 weeks each, anchored to the movements of the sun rather than the phases of the moon, is presented in the text, not as a human computational achievement but as a celestial revelation, a structure inherent in the sky itself that the Creator appointed as a sign for all his works, as the text says, for days and for Sabbaths, and for months and for feasts, and for years, and for Sabbaths of years and for Jubilees. The sun in the cosmological framework of Jubilees is not merely a source of light and heat. It is a timekeeper whose movements encode the structure of sacred time in a form that is in principle accessible to any observer with the patience to watch and the knowledge to interpret what they are watching. The moon, by contrast, is described in terms that the text carefully distinguishes from the solar framework of the lesser luminary, useful for certain purposes, but not the appropriate anchor for the calendar of covenant, because the moon's irregularity, its 10-day annual deficit relative to the solar year, makes it structurally unsuitable for the kind of precise temporal alignment that the relationship between the human community and the created order requires. The warning about lunar observation that the text issues is therefore not a warning about astronomy. It is a warning about reading the wrong document and mistaking it for the authoritative one. Abraham is the figure in whom the transition from celestial observation to celestial revelation is most clearly dramatized in the Book of Jubilees, and the account of his night of stargazing in Haran is one of the most extraordinary passages in a text full of extraordinary passages. He sits alone through the night of the new moon of the 7th month, watching the sky from evening to morning, attempting to read in the movements of the stars the character of the coming year with regard to the rains, and in the middle of that watching, something shifts, a word comes into his heart. The text says in that precise and careful language that Jubilees uses when it wants to describe the moment at which human observation opens into something larger than human observation can produce on its own. All the signs of the stars and the signs of the moon and of the sun are all in the hand of the Lord, he realizes, sitting alone in the darkness, with the sky above him and the silence pressing along the stones of the city around him. Why do I search them out? It is the question of a man who has been reading a secondary document and has suddenly understood that the primary document is not the sky itself, but the intelligence that organized the sky, and that the relationship he is seeking cannot be established through observation alone, but requires a different kind of opening, the kind that comes not from looking up, but from listening inward, from the stillness that the text immediately rewards with the voice of the angel, carrying the word of the Lord, speaking in Hebrew, in the tongue of the creation, the original language that had ceased from the mouths of all the children of men, from the day of the overthrow of Babel. The sky had been speaking all along in a language that the corruption of time and the scattering of peoples had made progressively inaudible. Abraham alone in the dark with his questions became the point at which that language was restored, somewhere above the ruins of every civilization that built its monuments toward the sky, and then forgot why the original document continues to move in its appointed courses, patient and precise, carrying the same information it has always carried, in the only medium that cannot be confiscated or corrupted, or excluded from any canon. Rest now? Now, traveller. The sky keeps its own record, it has never stopped. There is something the earth remembers that the institutions built upon its surface have consistently failed to preserve. Not in the metaphorical sense that landscape carries the traces of the lives lived across it, though. That is also true, but in the specific and literal sense that the ground beneath the foundations of the oldest surviving civilizations contains in its layers of compressed sediment and ash and collapsed architecture, a physical record of events whose scale and significance the official timeline of human prehistory has not yet fully incorporated into its account of how the world came to be the way it is. The Book of Jubilees treats the earth not as a passive stage upon which human history performs itself, but as a participant in the story, a created entity with its own relationship to the covenant, its own capacity for defilement and purification, its own response to the violations of the categories that the Creator established at the moment. When the dry land appeared from the receding waters and was appointed its proper function within the order of a world that was in that first moment of its existence exactly as it was meant to be. The Earth of Jubilees is a document like the sky, written in a language that the progressive corruption of human understanding has made increasingly difficult to read. The flood is the central event in the Earth's own narrative within the text, and the account that Jubilees gives of its mechanics is more specific than the version the approved canon preserves in ways that suggest access to a record of the event, rather than a theological elaboration of a cultural memory. The 7 floodgates of heaven and the 7 mouths of the fountains of the great deep. The text is precise about the numbers, about the sequence, about the duration of each phase of the rising and receding waters, about the specific new moons on which the critical transitions occurred. This precision is not decorative. In the cosmological framework of Jubilees, the flood was a calendrically structured event, an intervention in the physical order of the world that was organized according to the same Jubilee arithmetic that structured the history of the patriarchs, which means that the catastrophe that reset the earth was itself part of the pattern rather than a disruption of it, a phase in a longer sequence of creation and correction, whose overall architecture the Creator had established before the first human being drew breath. The earth did not experience the flood as an accident. It experienced it as a surgery, violent, total, and precisely timed. What the earth retained after the flood, according to the record that Jubilees preserves, was a set of geographical orientations, whose sacred significance the text treats as inherent, rather than assigned as qualities embedded in specific locations by the intelligence that designed the structure of the world, rather than qualities projected onto neutral space by the religious imagination of the communities that happen to inhabit those locations. The Garden of Eden is identified as the Holy of Holies of the earth, the dwelling of the Lord, the most sacred of the four places that the text names as the anchoring points of the terrestrial sacred geography. Mount Sinai is named as the centre of the desert. Mount Zion is named as the centre of the navel of the earth in a language that positions Jerusalem not as a city that became important through historical accident or military conquest, but as a location whose centrality was established at the moment of creation, and has persisted through every subsequent reorganization of the human world around it. These three were created as holy places facing each other. The text says in language, whose architectural precision implies a designer who worked in 3 dimensions, rather than a theologian who worked in metaphor. The Earth's relationship to blood is one of the most striking aspects of the cosmological framework that Jubilees preserves, and it is a relationship that the approved tradition has largely reduced to a dietary prohibition, without examining the physical theology that underlies it. The earth cannot be cleansed from the blood of man save by the blood of him that shed it. The text insists in language that is not speaking about legal justice in the social sense, but about a physical reality of the created order, about the way in which the earth itself is affected by violence, committed upon its surface, contaminated by it in a manner that requires a specific form of resolution before the contamination can be neutralized. Noah transmits this understanding to his sons in the period immediately following the flood, when the earth is still new, and the memory of what had defiled the previous world is still present in the consciousness of the survivors, and the transmission has the quality of a warning issued by someone who has seen what happens when the earth's relationship to blood is not respected, who watched an entire civilization be erased by a world that could no longer sustain the weight of what had been done upon its surface. Somewhere beneath the foundations of every city built upon ground that has witnessed more than it was ever meant to absorb, the earth holds its record in the only archive that has never been successfully managed or selectively edited by the institutions that rose and fell across its surface. Reston. Now, traveller, the earth beneath you is older than everything built upon it, and it remembers everything. There is a quality to the moment of return that is entirely different from the quality of departure, and the difference is not merely emotional, not simply the warmth of homecoming set against the uncertainty of leaving. The difference is epistemic. The person who returns to a place they have left carries in their perception a doubled vision, the ability to see both what is present and what was present before the absence. And in the gap between those two visions, the truth of what has changed, what has persisted and what was always more essential than it appeared in the original inhabiting, becomes legible in a way it never was before the departure made it possible to see it from outside. The Book of Jubilees is structured around a series of returns, the return of the patriarchs to the places where the covenants were made, the return of the covenant people to the land after centuries of exile, the ultimate return of the divine presence to dwell among the people it has always claimed as its own, and each of these returns is presented not as a repetition of what came before, but as a restoration of something whose full significance could only be understood after the loss that made the return necessary. Abraham's return from Egypt is one of the earliest and most structurally significant of these returns, and the account that Jubilees gives of it carries the precise and careful notation of a text that understands every movement of a patriarch as a movement within the larger pattern, rather than a biographical detail of merely personal interest. He journeyed back to the place where he had pitched his tent at the beginning, to the place of the altar, with the mountain of Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, and he blessed the Lord his God who had brought him back in peace, and called upon the name that he had invoked in that place before the departure into Egypt had interrupted the unfolding of the covenant in its appointed land. The return to the altar is not sentiment. It is a recalibration, a realignment of the individual story with the geographical coordinates of the sacred geography that the text has already established as embedded in the structure of the earth itself, rather than projected onto it by human religious imagination. And the act of offering at the return to altar is the act of a man who understands that the covenant is not portable in the way that a memory is portable, but is anchored to specific places on the surface of a specific earth that the Creator chose before the first human being was formed from its dust. Jacob's return from Mesopotamia carries this pattern to one of its most sustained and structurally elaborated expressions in the entire text. He left the land of covenant fleeing a brother's anger, crossed the boundary of the promised territory at Bethel where the adder appeared in his sleep and the Lord stood upon it and spoke. The covenant renewal over his sleeping form served 20 years in a foreign land under conditions that the text describes with an attention to the precise injustice of each exchange that suggests the recording of events whose every detail was considered significant and returned, carrying wives, children, cattle and possessions whose accumulation across the years of foreign service. The text presents as evidence of a divine superintendence operating through the mechanisms of ordinary economic life. But what Jacob carried back across the river that was more important than any of these was the direct encounter with the divine presence that had accompanied his departure and sustained his absence, and met him again at the moment of his return in the form of the angel with whom he struggled through the night at the ford of the Jabbok. The wrestling that left him limping and renamed, carrying in his body the physical evidence of a contact too intense for the human frame to absorb without alteration bearing in his new name. Israel, the record of an engagement with a force whose nature the approved tradition has spent centuries carefully managing into theological abstraction. The return of Jubilees itself, its re-emergence into the consciousness of a world that had been managing its absence for nearly 2,000 years, follows the same structural logic that the text describes in its accounts of the patriarchal returns. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, the gradual recovery of the Ethiopian manuscript tradition by scholars willing to work outside the boundaries of the approved canon, the slow accumulation of academic literature, examining the text with the seriousness it had always deserved. These are the mechanisms of a return that was in the framework of the text itself, always inevitable, because the structure that the text describes does not permit permanent loss, only temporary displacement, only the managed absence that the institutions of power can maintain for exactly as long as the pattern requires, before the restoration that the pattern has always been moving toward reasserts itself with the quiet, irresistible force of something that was never actually gone, but only waiting for the conditions that would make its return legible to the people who needed most to witness it. Somewhere in the distance, between every departure and every return, the thread of the covenant runs unbroken, invisible to the eye that looks only at surfaces, but present to any hand willing to reach into the dark and trust that what it is seeking has always been there. Rest now. Now, traveller. Everything that belongs to the pattern finds its way back. It always has. It always will. There is a mode of understanding that only becomes available in stillness, in the particular quality of attention that arises when the forward momentum of accumulation and acquisition has finally quieted enough for the mind to turn back upon the material it has gathered and see it whole rather than sequentially. The scholar who has spent years reading fragments in archives, turning pages as whose edges crumble at the touch, filling notebooks with observations that seemed individually significant, but whose relationship to one another remained obscure through all the hours of isolated examination arrives. Eventually, at a moment when the accumulated detail stops being a collection of separate things and becomes a single thing, a coherent form that was always present in the material but required the particular patience of sustained engagement before it became visible. The Book of Jubilees is a text that rewards exactly this kind of sustained reflective attention, and what becomes visible in the reflection is something that the sequential reading of its 50 chapters, moving from the revelation to Moses, through the creation narrative, through the patriarchal histories to the laws of Sabbath and covenant, does not fully disclose, which is the degree to which every element of the text is in conversation with every other element. The degree to which the whole is not the sum of its parts, but something considerably larger than that arithmetic would suggest. The reflection that the text invites is ultimately a reflection on the nature of faithfulness, on what it means across the enormous distances of time and catastrophe and institutional management to remain aligned with a structure whose full dimensions no single human life is long enough to perceive in their entirety. Abraham is the text's central meditation on this question, and the treatment of his faithfulness in Jubilees is more nuanced and more structurally significant than the version that the approved tradition has transmitted. Because the Jubilees account does not simply assert that Abraham was faithful, but demonstrates it through a sequence of 10 trials, whose accumulated weight is the evidence for a faithfulness that was not a single moment of dramatic obedience, but a sustained orientation maintained across decades of uncertainty, displacement, and the particular loneliness of a man who understood more about the structure of the world than anyone around him was yet equipped to receive. He was found faithful and was recorded on the heavenly tables as the friend of God. The text says in language that positions the heavenly record not as a metaphor for divine approval, but as an actual document, an archive maintained in a realm whose relationship to human time is not sequential in the way that human record keeping is sequential, but is instead simultaneous, containing the full pattern at every moment, rather than accumulating it gradually the way that earthly archives accumulate the deposits of passing time. The heavenly tables are one of the most distinctive and most consistently overlooked features of the cosmological framework that Jubilees preserves. They appear throughout the text as the ultimate source of authority for the laws and ordinances and calendar structures that the angel transmits to Moses, not the inventions of a human legislative tradition, not the accumulated wisdom of a particular community's experience, but records that were written before the events. They describe that contain the full pattern of history from creation to restoration in a form that is always already complete, that are engraved rather than written in the sense of being permanent rather than provisional. Fixed in a medium that does not deteriorate or admit of revision, or become subject to the kind of institutional management that earthly records inevitably undergo, when the institutions that control access to them have sufficient motivation to manage what people are permitted to read. The repeated invocation of the heavenly tables throughout the text. This is ordained and written on the heavenly tables. This law is engraved on the heavenly tables for all generations is not a rhetorical device designed to lend authority to human legislation. It is a cosmological claim about the relationship between the earthly record and the celestial original, a claim that positions every law, every ordinance, every calendrical structure preserved in the text as a copy of something that exists in a form immune to the corruptions that earthly copies inevitably suffer. The reflection that the text ultimately invites is a reflection on what it means to be the kind of people for whom these records were preserved. Jacob, in the final chapters of the patriarchal narrative that occupies the centre of Jubilees, gives all his books and the books of his fathers to Levi his son that he might preserve them and renew them for his children. Until this day, a transmission whose significance the text emphasizes through the care with which it records it, because the transmission of the books is the transmission of the pattern, and the transmission of the pattern is the act upon which everything else depends, the thing that makes the return possible after every departure. The thread that holds the fabric of covenant together across all the distances that the history of the world accumulates between the original giving and the ultimate fulfillment. Somewhere in the long chain of hands through which these records have passed from Enoch to Methuselah, to Lamech, to Noah, to Shem, to the keepers of highland monasteries, to the scholars of desert caves, to the researchers working in the early hours in rooms that smell of old paper and careful preservation, the original pattern remains intact, neither diminished by the distance it has travelled, nor distorted by the hands that carried it. Rest now, traveller. Reflection is not passivity, it is the deepest form of keeping. There is a movement in the Book of Jubilees that runs counter to the upward trajectory that most religious narratives prefer to emphasize, a movement not of elevation, but of descent, not of progressive illumination, but of deliberate immersion in the full weight of what the human story costs the people who carry it through the portions of history that are not triumphant, that are not characterized by covenant renewal and divine visitation, and the clear evidence of a pattern moving toward its fulfillment, but by the particular darkness of a people who have been told they are chosen and find themselves in bondage building cities for a civilization that has decided to treat their existence as a resource rather than a reality. The descent into Egypt is the central descending movement of the patriarchal narrative, and the Book of Jubilees treats it with the full gravity it deserves, not as a temporary inconvenience on the way to the liberation narrative that follows it, but as a phase in the pattern whose necessity was encoded in the structure of the covenant long before the first member of Jacob's family set foot on an Egyptian soil, whose duration and character were communicated to Abraham in the deep darkness of the covenant ceremony, in which the horror of great darkness fell upon him, and the voice from within that darkness told him precisely and without consolation what his descendants were going to experience before they received what they had been promised. Joseph's descent is the mechanism through which the larger descent is accomplished, and the account that Jubilees gives of it carries in its details the characteristic precision of a text that understands every individual fate as a function of the larger pattern, rather than an isolated event whose relationship to what comes before and after it is merely sequential. He was 17 years old when his brothers sold him to the Ishmaelite merchants, and the coat dipped in blood was sent to his father on the 10th day of the 7th month, and Jacob mourned all that night because they had brought it to him in the evening, and the grief that the text describes Jacob mourning for 1 year without ceasing. Bilhah dying of grief for Joseph. On the same day, Dinah, his daughter, dying after Joseph had perished 3 mornings upon Israel. In 1 month, this accumulation of loss has the quality not of narrative melodrama, but of a reckoning, a precise accounting of what the descent cost the generation that initiated it, recorded with the same fidelity to specific dates and specific consequences that characterizes the text's treatment of every significant event in the pattern. The 10th day of the 7th month became the text. Tells us the day ordained for the children of Israel to afflict themselves and make atonement once a year, the origin of the Day of Atonement embedded in the specific grief of a specific father on a specific night when his sons brought him the evidence of their betrayal, wrapped in the blood of a slaughtered kid. The descent of Jacob himself into Egypt is among the most carefully structured passages in the entire text, organized around a series of thresholds: the sacrifice at the well of the youth, the 7 days of waiting for the vision that would authorize the crossing, the appearance of the Lord in the night with the words that transform the descent from an act of desperation into an act of faith, whose sequence the text presents as a ritual of departure from the covenanted land that was as carefully observed as any of the festivals it had ordained for the calendar of covenant. Jacob was afraid to go down into Egypt, the text records in language that honors the fear as a proper response to the magnitude of what he was undertaking, rather than as a failure of confidence to be overcome. He remained 7 days at the well of the oath. The text says if perchance he should see a vision, as to whether he should remain or go down, and the waiting is not presented as hesitation, but as the correct procedure for a man who understood that a movement of this significance required celestial authorization before it could be undertaken without violating the structure of the pattern he had been entrusted to carry. The Lord appeared unto him and said, I am the God of thy fathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. I shall go down with thee, and I shall bring thee up again. The phrase I shall go down with thee is the most important phrase in the entire descent narrative, and it is the phrase that the institutional tradition has most consistently failed to examine with the attention it deserves, because what it claims is not merely divine accompaniment in the emotional sense of a comforting presence sustaining a frightened traveller through a difficult journey. It claims structural participation in the descent of the pattern itself into the darkness of exile, the willingness of the intelligence that designed the architecture of time to enter the phases of that architecture that are characterized by compression and constriction, and the apparent absence of all the signs that normally confirm the presence of the pattern in operation. The God of Jubilees does not wait at the edge of the darkness for his people to return from it. He descends into it with them carrying the blueprint of the restoration that the descent is making possible, patient as the darkness itself, certain as the return that was always already written into the structure of the covenant before the first step of the journey downward was taken. Somewhere in the depth of every darkness that the pattern requires its carriers to enter, the accompanying presence moves in the same direction at the same pace toward the same destination. Rest now, traveller. The descent is not abandonment. It has never been abandonment. It is the necessary depth from which the return derives its full meaning. There is a place in every profound narrative where the accumulated weight of everything that has come before arrives at a point of such concentrated significance that forward movement becomes temporarily impossible, not because the story has ended, but because the threshold between what was and what is about to be requires a particular quality of stillness before it can be crossed. The threshold is not a wall. It is a membrane, a boundary between states of being that has its own integrity, its own demand for attention, its own insistence that the person approaching it arrive with full awareness of what they are leaving behind before they can receive with full awareness what they are moving toward. The Book of Jubilees is approaching its own threshold in the final movements of the narrative it has been building across 50 chapters, and the entirety of the patriarchal history and the quality of attention that the text brings to this approach is one of the most striking demonstrations of its extraordinary sophistication. A sophistication that the institutional tradition's characterization of it as sectarian calendar polemic has almost entirely succeeded in obscuring from the general reader who might otherwise have encountered it as what it actually is, which is one of the most carefully constructed cosmological documents in the entire archive of ancient religious literature. The threshold that the text approaches is the threshold of the law, the moment on Mount Sinai toward which the entire narrative has been moving since its opening lines, when the angel of the presence descended to Moses and began to dictate the record that became the Book of Jubilees itself. Everything in the text has been preparation for this moment, and the preparation has been organised with the Jubilee calendar's characteristic architectural precision and building through this creation narrative and the antediluvian epoch, and the flood and the covenant with Noah, and the tower and the call of Abraham, and the long sequence of patriarchal faithfulness and failure and return until the accumulated history of the covenant people arrives at the mountain, where the full implications of everything that has happened since Adam, named the animals in the Garden of Eden, can finally be articulated in the form of law, not law as social contract, not law as the legislative product of a community reflecting on its experience, but law as the earthly expression of the celestial architecture that the heavenly tables have always already contained, transmitted through the membrane of the threshold at the moment when the pattern has prepared its recipient sufficiently to receive it without being destroyed by the proximity to its source. Moses at the summit of Sinai is the human being at the threshold in its most concentrated form, and the Book of Jubilees opens with his presence there in language whose simplicity is more powerful than any elaboration could achieve. The glory of the Lord abode on Mount Sinai, and a cloud overshadowed it 6 days. And he called to Moses on the 7th day out of the midst of the cloud, and the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a flaming fire on the top of the mount. The 7th day is not a coincidence in a text organized by the sacred mathematics of the number 7. It is a structural necessity. The threshold is crossed on the day that the creation week designated as the day of completion and rest, the day on which the Creator blessed and sanctified the structure of time by inserting into it a pause, a space of non-doing, that paradoxically contains more meaning than all 6 days of making that preceded it. Moses enters the cloud on the 7th day, which is to say he crosses the threshold at the moment when the calendar of creation designates as the moment of maximum proximity between the human and the divine, the moment when the boundary between the terrestrial and the celestial is thinnest, and the transmission of what the heavenly tables contain to the earthly record that will carry it forward is most possible. What Moses received at the threshold was not simply the 10 Commandments that the approved tradition has centered in its account of the Sinai event. He received, according to that record that Jubilees preserves the entire framework of time from creation to consummation, the earlier and the later history of the division of all the days of the law, and of the testimony in the precise language of the text, which is to say the blueprint of the pattern in its full form, the complete map of the Jubilee cycles that organized everything from the first breath of Adam to the final restoration that the pattern had always been moving toward. The 40 days and 40 nights that Moses spent on the mountain were not a period of passive reception, but an active transmission of a density so extraordinary that the text's description of it as the complete history of time is not hyperbole, but the most literal statement the language permits. The threshold was held open for 40 days, the same number of days that the rain fell upon the earth during the flood, the same number of years that the covenant people would wander in the wilderness before crossing into the land, a number whose recurrence in the most significant threshold. Crossing events of the entire narrative is another instance of the pattern, making itself visible to any reader attentive enough to look for it across the full extent of the text, rather than only in its individual passages. Somewhere at the edge of everything, the pattern has assembled across the 14 chapters of this record. The threshold stands as it has always stood present, patient, neither rushed nor delayed, waiting for the exact moment of readiness that the pattern itself has been preparing since before the first step of the journey toward it was taken. Rest now, traveller. The threshold is very close. You have been walking toward it longer than you know. There is a knowledge that arrives only in the threshold between waking and sleep, in the particular dissolving of the boundary between the conscious mind and the deeper architecture of understanding that the waking hours keep carefully separated from one another, in the interest of functional daily existence. The scholars who have spent their careers with the oldest texts will tell you, if you ask them in the unguarded hours late in the evening, when the professional caution that governs their public statements has relaxed enough to permit genuine reflection, that some of their most significant insights arrived, not at the desk, under the fluorescent light with the magnifying glass and the careful notes, but in the suspended state between waking and sleeping in the moment when the accumulated material of years of study suddenly reorganized itself into a coherence that the sequential analytical mind had been unable to achieve through all its disciplined effort. The Book of Jubilees is a text that seems designed in some fundamental way for exactly this state of consciousness for the mind that has released the grip of ordinary categorical thinking and allowed itself to rest in the larger pattern that the waking hours fragment into manageable pieces in order to make it possible to function within the structures of a world that has largely forgotten the whole from which those pieces were broken. The patriarchs of Jubilees received their most significant revelations in sleep. Jacob at Bethel, alone on the stone pillow with the sun set and the darkness pressing along the road in every direction, receives the vision of the ladder and the renewal of the covenant in a dream whose content is so precisely structured. The angels ascending and descending. The Lord standing upon the ladder, the words of promise delivered with the calm authority of something being stated rather than promised, because its fulfillment was never in question. That the text treats the sleeping state not as a diminished form of consciousness, vulnerable to the distortions of the unconscious imagination, but as an enhanced form of receptivity, a condition in which the noise of ordinary waking perception has quieted enough for the signal that was always present to become audible. The stone he places under his head becomes upon waking the pillar he anoints with oil and names as the house of God, because the place where the boundary between the terrestrial and the celestial became permeable in sleep remains in waking marked as a threshold. A location on the surface of the sacred geography whose coordinates have been permanently altered by the contact that occurred there in the night. Abraham receives his most devastating and most structurally significant revelation. The foreknowledge of the 400 years of bondage, the promise of the ultimate liberation, the covenant of the land in a state the text describes as an ecstasy, a horror of great darkness, a condition that occupies the boundary between waking vision and sleeping dream in a way that the language of ordinary consciousness cannot fully accommodate. He had been watching the fire pass between the divided pieces of the covenant sacrifice, maintaining the vigil against the birds that descended upon the pieces and had to be driven away, an act of protective attention that the text presents as ritually significant as the human contribution to a ceremony whose other participants were operating at a level of reality that the ceremony itself was designed to make briefly accessible to the human participant. And then the sun set, and the ecstasy fell upon him, and the darkness enclosed him. And the voice spoke from within the darkness with the calm precision of someone reading from a document that had always already been written. The horror of the darkness was not terror in the psychological sense. It was the appropriate response of a finite consciousness to direct proximity with the infinite record, the physical experience of a human nervous system registering the weight of a knowledge too vast for it to hold without the altered state that the ecstasy provided, as a kind of protective membrane between the receiver and the full force of what was being transmitted. The descent into sleep that the Book of Jubilees has been preparing throughout its 50th chapters is not a metaphor for death or defeat or the extinction of consciousness. It is the deliberate movement toward the state in which the pattern becomes most fully perceptible, the release of the sequential categorical institutionally managed waking mind into the deeper architecture of understanding that the sleep state makes accessible precisely because it cannot be controlled, cannot be edited, cannot be subjected to the kind of careful management that the waking hours allow the institutions of approved knowledge to exercise over what their subjects are permitted to perceive. The covenant is made in the darkness. The ladder appears in the night. The voice speaks in the ecstasy between waking and sleeping. The angel descends with the tablets in the vision of the night. The pattern reveals itself most fully in the hours when the defences of the ordinary mind have been lowered by the necessity of rest, and the text that has been carrying this revelation across 3,000 years of institutional management arrives most completely into the consciousness of the reader who receives it in exactly this state, released from the waking world, drifting toward the threshold, carrying everything they have heard tonight into the deeper country where the pattern speaks without the interference of everything that has been built to prevent its transmission. Rest now, traveller. The descent into sleep is not the end of understanding. It is the beginning of the kind that cannot be managed away. There is a particular quality to the ending of a record that was never meant to end, that was designed from the first word of its first chapter to be not a conclusion but a transmission, not a terminus, but a threshold from which the pattern it has been carrying continues forward into whatever comes after the last page, into the consciousness of whoever received it into the hours and days and years that follow, the reading in ways that the reader will not always be able to trace directly back to the text, but will recognize in moments of unexpected clarity as the residue of having once been in genuine contact with something older and larger and more precisely organized than anything the institutions of approved knowledge had prepared them to encounter. The Book of Jubilees ends with the commandment regarding the Sabbaths, with the final ordinance, the last of the laws that the angel of the presence has been transmitting to Moses across the entirety of the 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain. And the ending has the quality of a door being closed very quietly from the inside by someone who knows that what remains in the room after the closing will continue to operate without them, that the pattern does not require the narrator's continued presence in order to proceed, that the transmission has been completed, and what happens next belongs to the receiver rather than the sender. Herewith is completed the account of the division of the days, the final line of the text, in the careful and exact language of a document that has spent 50 chapters insisting on the sacred significance of precisely this, the division of the days, the structure of time, as a form of communication between the creator and the created, the calendar as covenant, the organization of the year as the earthly expression of a celestial architecture that was established before the first human being drew breath and will persist after the last institution built to manage access to it has returned to the dust from which everything that is not the pattern was made. The ending does not summarize, it does not draw conclusions, it does not offer the reader the comfort of a narrative resolution that wraps the accumulated material into a shape whose meaning can be grasped and set aside. It simply states that the account has been completed, and in that statement it implies everything that the completion of the account makes possible the carrying forward of the pattern by those who have received it. The continued operation of the Jubilee cycles, whether or not any human institution acknowledges their authority, the persistence of the covenant across every disruption and exile and institutional suppression that the history of the world will accumulate between the moment of transmission and the moment of ultimate restoration. What the final chapter of Jubilees preserves in its insistence on the absolute sanctity of the Sabbath and the absolute authority of the laws governing it is not a legal code in the narrow sense that the tradition reducing the text to sectarian calendar polemic has always preferred. It is a cosmological argument in its final and most concentrated form, an argument that the structure of time is not a human convention but a divine institution, that the 7-day week with its culminating day of cessation and blessing is not a cultural artifact evolved through the practical needs of agricultural societies, but the earthly reflection of a pattern established on the 7th day of creation, when the Creator rested from all his works and hallowed the rest as the form of time most fully aligned with the nature of the reality that the 6 days of making had brought into existence. The Sabbath of Jubilees is not a day of restriction. It is the day on which the ordinary operations of the created world pause long enough for the pattern underlying them to become visible, the day on which the constant forward movement of productive time stops, and the stillness that results is not empty but full of the presence that the noise of the working week had been obscuring, full of the relationship between heaven and earth that the calendar was always designed to maintain, and that the corruption of the calendar has been progressively eroding across the centuries, since the original transmission was managed out of the mainstream of the tradition it was meant to sustain. The final resting place of the record that the Book of Jubilees has been carrying is not a library, not an archive, not a canon, not an institution. It is the consciousness of the person who has followed it this far through the long hours of the night, who has drifted with it through the 17 movements of its dark and patient archaeology, who carries now in the quiet country between waking and sleeping the residue of having been in genuine contact with a transmission that left the mountain of Sinai 3,000 years ago, and has been travelling through sealed chambers and desert caves and highland monasteries and academic footnotes and late-night archives ever since, looking for the minds awake enough in the right kind of darkness to receive it without the filters that the waking world installs between every human consciousness and the pattern that the pattern has always been trying to reach. Somewhere beneath the ruins of everything built to contain it, the original record still breathes patient as the stone that holds the oldest inscriptions, ancient as the first division of light from darkness present in this room, in this silence, in the particular quality of this night that has brought you all the way to the final word of the final chapter of a text that was always addressed to exactly you. Sleep now, traveller. The past will keep watch. It always has. And the pattern having found you will not let you go, and so the account is completed, traveller. The division of the days has been spoken. The record has been passed from the mountain through the angel, through the manuscript, through the sealed caves and the highland monasteries and the long centuries of careful silence, and now through this night into the particular stillness where you are resting. You were never supposed to hear this. The councils that made their quiet decisions in rooms whose documentation did not survive made certain of that or believed they had. But the pattern does not require institutional permission to continue operating. It never has. It simply waits for the conditions that make transmission possible, the right kind of darkness, the right kind of silence, the right kind of mind willing to follow the thread without demanding that it lead somewhere the approved maps have already charted. What you carry now in the country between waking and sleeping is older than every institution ever built to contain it. It was written on heavenly tables before the first human hand learned to hold a stylus. It was sealed in desert caves by people who understood that what they were preserving was more important than their own survival. It was copied by lamplight in stone monasteries by monks whose names no archive remembers. History was rewritten, but it was never erased. Some truths survive only in whispers, and tonight one of them found you. Rest now, traveller. The past will keep watch. It always has.